All right, thank you, Carolyn. So we're going to start today with segment number one, which is new devices from the holidays. So these are devices that are new to runZero, right? So obviously we have our explorers running in environments throughout the world, and right around the holidays, we start to see some new devices, typically IoT devices that show up that are just new to the market, or at least new to us. And today we want to show you and talk about what these new devices are. And as we talk about these, we're very curious to know if any of you in the attendees have seen any of these. So if you have seen any of these or have any comments on these, or if you have any information that you'd like to share about these devices, please do put that in the Q&A channel, and I'll read them aloud as they come through. But we have our own thoughts on these devices, which we'll share now. And let's start with Rob. Anything you want to highlight from this list that we have over here?
So I think the coolest part about this is that these are new devices that we've never seen, but we still this is not an ad. This is just something that I think is super cool. We're fingerprinting these even though we've never seen it before accurately the first time. It's super rad. Just all the different techniques that we can use to get a device to identify itself. Um, the and being around the holidays, it's a lot of consumer electronics, phones and things like that. But these new ones, that are new to us, I think the coolest one I saw was, at least to me, was the Azevedo network time keeping device thing. And that is, from what it looks like, a little electronics device that does interfaces with the GPS global positioning system to get accurate time, and then lets you build home electronics projects. Like their website has a bunch of Nixie tube clocks and things, which is really really cool. PSA: Nixie tubes will kill you. Be careful. Super high voltage, but they look amazing. And you can also now get GPS accurate time and identify your clock with runZero. So I thought that was cool. That made my day.
All right, thank you. And one particular one that I thought was really interesting is the crock pot. Right?
Hmm.
I don't know if we've ever seen cookware showing up on the network before.
Hmm.
Have like HD, do you know? Have we ever seen cookware?
Yeah, we did a teardown and an analysis of a ANOVA what do you call them, sous vide machine a while back, but that was the last one I looked at.
Oh, okay. So we've had a sous vide machine. Well, this is a crock pot, and I did some digging into this because I was just, it was just bizarre to me that we're seeing cookware. So apparently, Crockpot, the company, decided they wanted to add the capability to basically operate your crock pot with your an app on your phone, right? And this particular, I found it on Amazon. So if you want to go order it, there it is. But you can use your phone to adjust the cooking time, the temperature, shift to warm, and turn it on or off. And rather than building this out themselves, they partnered with a company called Wemo, which is a, a subsidiary of Belkin, which is why, Rob, you saw Belkin showed up in the fingerprinting. And Wemo is just like a home automation company that Belkin owns. I don't think there's any particular attack vectors that could be done through the crock pot, but it could.
And spoiler alert, there was that show that was really popular. This is Us. Spoiler alert, somebody died due to a crock pot. So, there's an attack vector there.
Okay, so it's more than hacker shenanigans then. Like you
Yes,
can
yes.
you can blow up a hot crock pot and kill people. Because I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
thinking
it burned the house down or something. So,
who's gonna ransomware your lunch? Like that's not that's
hmm.
not really so I thought at best it's just like someplace for someone to go hang out while they're looking at the rest of it. But okay, yeah,
Meet
I
me at the
mean,
crock pot.
all right. So anyway, that's just thought. Oh, I just realized on Amazon this crock pot is currently unavailable. I guess they were all sold out over the holidays, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, let's talk about the fingerprinting of these new devices that we've seen over the holidays. Who wants to take that?
I mean, I can, blather on. I do find it also, just speaking about the crock pot, there is something very whimsical about seeing, Crockpot API version 1, you know, because I mean, you can always improve your Crockpot API. It's important to see that. But no, the way we fingerprint these devices is pretty neat. So a lot of consumer electronics and consumer devices want to be discoverable. You know, they want you to be able to discover them to integrate with you know, HomeKit or whatever to make you be able to control it with your phone. And a lot of times they use relatively standard discovery protocols, UPnP and things like that. Sometimes they don't. I had some, this is not on the list, but I had some fun with, there was a smart plug that I had the other day. HD loaned it to me. I broke his coffee pot, sorry. But I was able to figure out how it was discoverable on the network. It was, you know, you send out a little quasi-encrypted broadcast and it would respond. And then you suddenly be like, oh, I now know where all my power plugs are, which, what a time to be alive. But that's how we're able to fingerprint these devices that we've never seen before a lot of the time, is they'll speak relatively standard protocols or relatively derivative protocols that we kind of already know or can figure out pretty quickly. And it's a lot of fun. It's like solving a mystery novel every day. I love it.
Excellent. All right. I think that's all the time we have right now for the new devices that showed up over the holidays.
Are you sure that's the time? Did you use your Azevedo network time device to verify?
No, I use the time on my laptop, and then that's what I'm going with. All right.
Probably one trend worth calling out, though. We're starting to see a lot more of like devices by not name brand technology companies, like kitchen cookware, for example, embedding like like an embedded version of like you know, Kindle Fire OS or a Roku media streaming service or an Apple streaming service. Like we're starting to see kind of these standard kind of off-the-shelf embedded toolkits being dropped in all sorts of devices. So even though, you know, there may be 50 kinds of consumer crock pots available next year, there's probably only going to be 3 networking stacks and 3 OSs driving them all.
And there, it is interesting. I'll keep it brief. It is interesting too that a lot of the protocols will, these identification protocols will distinguish between manufacturer and integrator. So, you know, this is a Roku smart device, for example, but it's an LG TV or a TCL TV or something like that. So,
yeah, it begs the question: what is a device, right? Is it?
Yep.
It
gets philosophical real fast.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you were to take a network card out of a device and put it into another device,
yeah,
did the device,
it's a real ship of Theseus thing,
moved on? Yeah. All right. Anyway, okay. So let's switch topics here. We'll switch topics and head over into the rest of our runZero hour today and start talking about TLS. And we're going to talk about TLS fingerprinting the hard way, but also potentially the right way. So let's go to Tom here. Why is it important that we fingerprint TLS in the first place?
Yeah, so we've got a custom TLS fingerprinter or custom TLS fingerprinting logic. And sort of the genesis of that was in October 2022, there was a pre-announcement of a critical vulnerability in OpenSSL. And a lot of folks who had been in the security space for a while remember prior such events like Heartbleed from 2014, where it was a major problem. It impacted broad swaths of the ecosystem, and it had to be addressed. And our concerns were, oh no, this is another critical vuln. We haven't had a critical rated vuln from OpenSSL probably since Heartbleed. This is something we need to get in front of, like we being runZero, so we can help our customers identify where that lives so they can go remediate. And because OpenSSL and a lot of other custom SSL stacks, but OpenSSL in particular is everywhere. And so we needed the ability to, with relative confidence, go identify that in places where it wasn't obvious. And, so there are a couple different tools and techniques for fingerprinting TLS that didn't fit for a couple different reasons, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But because we couldn't pick something up that already existed or a technique that already existed, HD started a project to internally try to find out if we couldn't develop a system for fingerprinting that was more robust. because there are issues that impact fingerprinting that are often under network or end user control, the configuration options that impact fingerprinting. We needed something that was relatively resilient to those type of changes in the environment. And so we started the effort off internally. Now, fortunately, between the time that the pre-release announcement came out and the time that the patch ultimately came out, the vulnerability got re-rated from a critical to a high. It turns out that the only real way to exploit this was in very niche, very corner cases. It didn't impact most folks. It had to do with interpreting like an email field on the X509 certificate. And so like the ways that could be leveraged by an attacker were so small that it didn't really rate being critical anymore. So that was great. But we already had a fingerprinting system. And so we continued to develop it because we knew that in the future, at some point, it will matter. Like it may not be this year, but at some point it's going to come up again. And having something relatively robust in our pocket that's already working is something that, because it's complex to develop, we wanted to have in place and just be doing.
Yeah, I remember that vulnerability kind of turned out to be a dud a little bit, but we got something great out of it. So fingerprinting the hard way, right? What does that mean? Is it looking at the cipher spec that's being offered or being accepted? Because I mean, there's very little of that conversation that is in plain text, right at the beginning. So that's not a whole lot to work with. Like, so what is fingerprinting the hard way, and why is it better than the naive way?
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of context, the way I think about fingerprinting is there are like three major ways to do it. And if you think about it, like MFA authentication has like the main three ways that people do things, the major factors. It's something you have, something you know, and something you are. When I think about fingerprinting, typically it's done in like one of three ways. The target tells you there's something like a server header that whenever you talk to the server, it returns this header, and it might tell you that it's Apache and it's using OpenSSL. That's sort of the easy way. Then there's attribute based. It's something that is particular about the implementation that you can see. And then there's behavior based. It's when you do a thing to it, does it behave one way or another? Mm-hmm. And like to use another analogy to think about how you can identify these type of things when you're looking at sort of like a black box on the remote end is if you have let's say you have a favorite sports team and they're all out on the field, and they all have the exact same uniforms, no names, no nothing. But you're really familiar with your team. You see them run out on the field and you're trying to figure out who's who. So like the thing where something tells you what it is like asking the player as they run by. And maybe one of them says their name, nobody else does. And the attribute side, something about that implementation might be, that one of the players is 6'4" and nobody else is over 6 feet. Or some of the other players are 5'3", 5'7", something like that. And there's only like two of those. And so you can look at the players on the field and go like, that's that person. And these two are like probably these two over here. I can't tell which is which, but I can like categorize them. I can take the full set of implementations and I can limit it down to it's probably one of these two people. You can look at things like for American football players, you could tell the linebackers versus the others just by their physical stature. So that's attributes. You can see these things about them and you can either identify them uniquely or you can at least put them in a bucket. And then there's behavior based. So in that same sports team, once you've kind of got them bucketed, if it's American football, you've got a person who's throwing the ball, probably the quarterback. Or if it's soccer or hockey, you've got a person who's in the goal, probably your goalie. You've got things like, all right, maybe you have two quarterbacks, one's left-handed, one's right-handed. So you can watch their behavior. Who's throwing? You can probably tell which one is which. Or receivers, you've got a couple people who are catching the ball. You can at least group them down to like, I know these people are receivers. And then maybe I can use some other attribute like height. It'll say, oh, of the receivers, it's probably this person. So there are attribute-based things that we can look at, and there are behavior-based things that we can look at so that we can start categorizing things. And sometimes that gets down to a unique set. And then sometimes that gets down to like a group of things. And all you can really do is just put them in a bucket and go, it's probably this, until you can figure out something else later. They do something new, you learn another way to observe them, or you get another detail about them.
So self-identification, attribute-based, and behavior-based. What about the existing methods for TLS fingerprinting? Which ones do they use?
It varies. Like a lot of standard fingerprinting will just like ask for the banner. That's one thing that's already talked about. you had some techniques like JA3S that you could use to identify the SSL stack on the remote server that would look at the TLS version that was negotiated, the cipher that the server selected, like the cipher suite, like RSA and AES, some permutation of those, or cha-cha 20. And then like TLS has a bunch of extensions, sort of add-on technologies that the server could advertise and say, I support this thing and this other thing. And it would look at those too. And it would just take this combination and then basically build a hash and do a lookup and say, if I see this combination, it's probably this person. The problem with some of that is that some of those factors are under the control of the end user. So like if they're using the configuration out of the box, you might fingerprint it pretty well. But if you're in an environment, and I've been in these environments, I've managed some of these environments where you have requirements for improving the base level of security or reducing the level of security. I've been in environments where we had to support, like years ago, Windows XP running old versions of IE. So I had to enable cipher suites I wouldn't have otherwise had enabled. So you're changing those values and it makes it hard to fingerprint reliably. You just get into this unknown bucket. And so that's within the realm of what a user can control. And then there are other techniques or tools like JARM or fingerprint TLS, where they may be robust, but they may have additional concerns, whether it's intellectual property, it's the license that's involved with it, or if the technique works, but there's a corpus of known fingerprints and you can't use that because of licensing. And so there were some, all that fed into sort of the decision making about rolling our own versus leveraging something that's like JARM that people understand and they use in other tools, like Wireshark uses that. Some other tools use it.
All right. So how do we do it? Like, what was the thing that you and HD built last year? It was September, right? Right around then, I think, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, it was
Yeah, that sounds about right.
definitely tricky. So like the challenge between OpenSL, so what we're trying to do is determine, is it OpenSL 1 or is it OpenSL 3? Like, is it 111 or is it 300? The challenge is they went and rewrote the entire stack, which is great. So theoretically, they'd be different. Unfortunately, they rewrote it identically. So literally every single byte you sent to a OpenSL 111 system would get the same response from an OpenSL 1 and an OpenSL 3. So the question is, well, if you send the same data, get the same response, what do you do about that? And that's kind of where I love like the runZero approach to it, which is like, well, let's kind of go around the box. Let's go look at something else. Let's stop looking at just this flow of bytes between the two things. Let's start looking at things like timing. Let's try making multiple connections. Let's try doing weird things to our connection. So we found almost accidentally in this case, I think I had a bug in my test code where the client side crashed. And so when the client side of a TCP connection crashes, your OS stack sends a TCP FIN packet to the end system, what's effectively known as a half close. Then the server responds back with its own FIN, and then you reset the connection and things like that. But what's interesting is that the only difference between OpenSL 1 and OpenSL 3 during the handshake was that if you half close your TCP session on OpenSL 1, nothing happens. If you have to close your TCP session on OpenSL 3, you actually get an SSL alert or TLS alert triggered by the server side back to you. So you can effectively determine the difference just by doing a partial half close of the socket, which is something that's really difficult to kind of stumble over, but it's really valuable when you find things like that. So that's kind of an example of like how we look at not just the byte flow or the timing, but also what are the like behavioral aspects of the stack when you start doing interesting things.
Do you think they intentionally wanted it to be super backwards compatible, like down to the
Yeah. I mean, so OpenSL is like it's dead, right? OpenSL 111 is now end of life. There's no more support for it. Everyone's supposed to be using OpenSL 3, so it literally has to be byte for byte compatible if you want folks to move forward.
Yep.
So that's an example of behavior based. Anything else around behavior based that we built into this TLS fingerprinting?
There's a few around TLS. There's another example I like to share though around SMB. So if you're connecting to like port 445 or 139 on a device over TCP and trying to negotiate the session, there's an entire class of devices that when you make a second connection for the same source IP, it disconnects the first session you have. So if you want to be able to fingerprint a device, you literally just make two connections instead of one. And depending on the behavior you get, you know whether it's what version of Windows or a different version of Windows. And that's another fun trick on the behavioral side.
What about attribute side?
On the attribute side, like there are certain things that that you can tell that have been added in various implementations that don't exist in other ones that you can use to sort of differentiate. So, for example, there may be a cipher suite that was added in a later version of TLS, of a particular TLS library. So you can say, okay, I think it's OpenSSL. But if I see this one cipher suite, then I know that its range is at least this version and higher. For example, TLS 1.3 was added to OpenSSL in version 1.1.1. So if I think something's OpenSSL, but I see TLS version 3, I know that it's at least that level. There are things like timestamp randomization, where a value is supposed to be random. However, there are some implementations, particularly older implementations, that use the system time as this random value in this packet. And so more modern implementations, more robust and rigorous implementations, they set this to be a true random value. But older versions of S-channel, or most of S-channel actually, older versions of GNU TLS, older versions of OpenSSL, they may use the timestamp. And so you can see, is it random? Is it timestamp? And then you have to do some things where sometimes random accidentally gets close to the actual timestamp, and you have things like clock drift on your target. So you have to make a couple requests and go, okay, what's the variance? What's the range? Is it random, but it's within 10, 15 seconds or something like that? Okay, it's probably actually the timestamp, but their time is set for 2026 or 1970. So there's
Doesn't that
things
seem
like
like
that.
just like not even doing the minimum amount of work for randomization? Like you're just taking time t, like, and that's it. Like done. Good enough,
Yeah.
which is not. But
Time is an illusion.
it's a construct, and it's a construct that shows up in protocols all the time. So there's things like that are attribute based. Behavior based, there's a couple more that we look at. Like, for example, there's an extension to TLS called server name indicator, where whenever you communicate to a remote server, you can say, here's the name I want to communicate with. I want to communicate with www.runzero.com. And the reason that's important is you might have website hosters that have 100 or a couple hundred websites that are all on the same server or the same TLS termination endpoint, and it needs to know what certificate to give you. Because if you give an endpoint if you give a client the wrong certificate, it's going to go, oh yeah, I'm not trying to talk to you, and drop the session. So it needs to know which one is there. And so SNI is an extension to the protocol where the client can say, I'm trying to talk to this particular endpoint, and it's part of the packet. And what you can do, like from a behavior-based standpoint, is send an empty value, send a long value, send some invalid values. And this is one of the few places where we don't follow protocol spec whenever we're talking to endpoints. We normally try to keep things constrained, and this is one of the few places where we deviate. So you can send those values, and you can see, does it drop the session? Does it just keep trucking and give you the default certificate, which is a thing that happens and shouldn't? Does it send you a TLS alert code? And if it does, what code is it? It could be unexpected data. It could be some other alert code. And those things give us other attributes to take our total set and more constrain it to a likely set of targets.
So what are the next steps for our TLS fingerprinting? Like where's the room for improvement here?
So there's definitely room for improvement in the sense of like getting larger sample sizes as we see different protocol sets, and adding them to our corpus and looking at how they behave. There is opportunity to look at different differentiator, like trying to find another indicator that we're not using currently, and then go back and look at our corpus and check each one of those implementations and see what they say, and determine, is it good enough of an indicator to use in our logic, and is it resilient enough? Because there are some challenges sometimes when you're doing fingerprinting where you get middle boxes or other technology messing with your responses. And so you need to be able to tolerate those type of that type of interference.
Would it help us with forked libraries, for example, in the future?
Yes, to a certain degree. Like forked libraries are definitely a challenge for us. And a great example of that is after the Heartbleed vulnerability in 2014, I think it was, the OpenBSD project forked OpenSSL into LibreSSL. That's their own implementation. And then they started hardening and working on it. Google did the same thing, and they created a thing called Boring SSL, which is its own weird beast. And so for like a while, because they're literally the same code for a certain number of release, they look exactly and behave exactly the same. They are the same code, but then you get deviations over time. So for example, LibreSSL pretty quickly after forking dropped complete support for SSL v2 and v3. So if you think it's OpenSSL, an early version of OpenSSL, but you see SSL v2 or v3 support, probably not LibreSSL, but you have to wait for enough deviation in behavior to determine where those happen. And we've done things like gone through release logs, years worth of release logs for various TLS stacks to try to find out, oh, they introduced this feature, or they deprecated this feature, but it's still available, but then they removed it at this later date. So we can't really rely on deprecation, but we can rely on things like they completely remove support for SSLv3. But that's definitely a challenge, and it's a place for it's an opportunity for improvements, like looking for those places or going in and digging deeper to try to find differences.
So in terms of challenges, what about S channel? Because I know that from our data, we know that a significant number of TLS endpoints out there are leveraging S channel.
Yeah, it's something like, if you take a given sample set, it's something like 50% are S channel. And S channel has some challenges in that it's almost like it's this improv TLS stack. It does yes and to freaking everything. So things that we often throw packets at that are malformed, it's like, okay, cool. You don't get an alert. You often don't get a session that's dropped. It's just like keeps trucking, which kind of makes it resilient. It's kind of the thing you want. Although in some cases, like some niche cases, you'd kind of like it to drop the connection because the request is corrupt or invalid in some way. But it does become hard to fingerprint because there are fewer differences between the S channel versions and a couple other libraries, simply because it goes, okay, like it's tolerant of most things where we would abuse it. And like we can still fingerprint it pretty reliably. And things like having a fixed timestamp, server time, having the timestamp value, having the random value be an actual timestamp is a pretty strong indicator. But getting down into individual details is much harder, and it takes relying upon attributes that are user configurable. Now you have to start relying on, do I see this protocol suite? Do I see this cipher suite? Things like that have broad spectrum of ranges where they're supported. They're supported on 2008 as well as 2016, Windows 2016. And so like it gets harder to sort of bucket them into where they need to reliably bucket them into certain versions.
Right. So Rob, coming to you here, anything you want to weigh in on the way we do TLS fingerprinting, or just, do you wish that protocol implementers had fingerprinters in mind when they write their code?
So I think first off, thank you, Tom. That was awesome. I'm going to need Tom to explain sports to me in terms of TLS, because that's going to be actually how I'll understand things. But no, I think the coolest thing about this, or one of the coolest things about the way we do it, is especially when you're dealing with IoT devices and things like that, or embedded software. Let's say you have a vulnerability in OpenSSL, 1.1 or something. I'm just picking a version at random. And you're like, well, where do I have OpenSSL 1.1? I can audit my Linux devices. I can log into my systems and see what versions of libraries there are and all that. But I don't know that my, Frabozco music player thing, whatever, has OpenSSL 1.1 in there. But with runZero, when you do the active scanning and you poke at it and you do things, just like people, they make different reactions when you poke them, and you can say, oh, this little random IoT device is running a vulnerable version, and now I know that I've got this vulnerable device on my network, even though there's not actually a way to get onto the device and say, hey, by the way, tell me about the software you've got, and you may have to dig through some documentation if you're lucky. So I think that's really cool. I think that's a really neat thing. So
to literally to that point, we've leveraged that technique to try to figure out what stack is on the device we're scanning. We've leveraged sort of the some companies publish GPL notices. Here's all the GPL software that we run in this environment. Software bill of materials, another one, and specifically the Apple TV has at least 3 TLS protocol stacks on it. It has OpenSSL, Boring SSL, and either GNU TLS or Libre SSL. Can't remember which one it is. And you can see that by going to their open source release notes, and you can see they're there. And the challenge becomes, which service on that endpoint is using that stack? Or is it just a client only stack? They may be using services for Libre SSL, but they have OpenSSL for something that is on box reaching out that we wouldn't necessarily see. And so SBOM and GPL notices, things like that, are things we've had to go through before just to try to figure out what is this thing, because it doesn't look like anything else we've seen. And is that because they have configured this box in a unique way? Is it because it's a stack we haven't seen? Like what's the thing there? But again, it's only useful if they publish that data and you have like some kind of reference where you can scope in things now. But we've literally had to do that before.
Mhm.
Sounds like they might have had 3 separate development teams developing different services for that one device. Oh. All right.
3 TLS stacks in a trench coat.
Like one big tall TLS. All right. So let's move on to the next segment, which is TLS oddities, the out-of-date ones, the vulnerable ones, and the ones that are hard to fingerprint. Listen, folks, you're going to learn something about TLS today, one way or another, because it's all TLS. Okay, so back to Tom here. You want to start with OpenSSL 1.1?
Yeah, so sort of in the category of out of date stacks is OpenSSL 1.1. OpenSSL 1.1 went end of life September 11th last year. Rob's got a great blog post about why that matters and how you can find it using literally our technology here. But it went into life last year, and we still see it pretty much everywhere. Like if you take a given sample, roughly 25% of that is going to be some version of OpenSSL 1.1 or direct fork of that. Usually with OpenSSL 1.1, we're kind of confident, we're pretty confident that's what that is, because the forks of Libra and Boring are both 1.0 forks, and there's slight behavior changes there. But it's out there and it's prevalent. And the question might be for that is like, okay, it's end of life. Do I care? And the answer to that question is yes and no. So as far as I know, there are no published vulnerabilities for 1.1. So it's not like, oh my God, I need to go fix this today. But it is a proxy indicator. And I love this term proxy indicator. I use it all the time. And for me, what it means is you can look at this one detail and you can infer other details about what you're observing. So if I look at a box and it's got OpenSSL 1.1, that might not say it's vulnerable, but it will tell you some things about how that box is being maintained, the life of the software, when it was developed, and things like that. So from a risk standpoint, just because it's running 1.1 doesn't mean it's a problem necessarily, but it does mean that if a problem does come out, the next Heartbleed comes out tomorrow, the effort involved with getting that device's stack up to a patched version, which would be some version of OpenSSL 3.x, the lift is much higher, because you're not just implementing a minor patch of OpenSSL. You're actually having to completely change from 1.x to 3.x and do all the testing that comes along with that, all the compatibility testing that comes along with that. And so if it comes out, you can be assured that these devices will take longer to get remediated, to get software updates. And so there's additional risk there when that happens. And it also, like, knowing it's there speaks a little bit to the development cycles and pressures of the people who build that software. There's not a pressing need necessarily for some very old internal device to not be running 1.1. But if it does become a problem tomorrow, it's going to be harder to fix. And it may not be as strong an indicator this year, but next year it will be. Your vendor has not provided an update, or you have not applied an update in a year to bring this up to a supported of OpenSSL. So it's sort of a proxy indicator for sort of the life cycle challenges and risk management of the environment that it lives in. If it's a printer in your home environment, it's probably not a big deal. Is it a router that's on your public facing interface? Is it doing TLS termination for you? That's an entirely different animal.
So from what we're seeing, what percentage of the population is OpenSSL 1.1? What percentage is like maybe 3.x?
So of the OpenSSL implementations, we've seen about 10% that have upgraded from 1.x to 3.x. And OpenSSL 3 has been out for a couple years. It wasn't strongly pushed until we had that issue that we talked about earlier, where there were some concerns, and people started. That was one of the cases where the bug was in 3.x. And so had you upgraded earlier, you actually were in a worse position than when you were on 1.x. But around that time period, you started seeing a little more activity and pressure to go ahead and get to later versions of 1.x and then migrate off of it. But it is somewhat surprising to see that the footprint is only still about 10% of the chunk that is OpenSSL in general.
Are you seeing something similar on the side of the Java endpoints, TLS endpoints?
Yeah, so surprisingly, TLS is a very small percentage of our observed endpoints. But amongst all that, we do see some very old versions of Java being used, or ranges of Java. We can bucket Java down to like Java 7, say update 79 or so, through Java 8 update 265. It falls in one bucket. That will pretty much behave the same way. And when you look at that, you go, wow, well, Java 7 went ELL, went end of life in 2015. So 8 years ago. Now it's an Oracle product, and Oracle offers paid support for certain people. And so if you pay them, you can get additional support. And there's some additional downloads for non-commercial use and stuff. But in general, like if you're still running Java 7 and it's in mission critical, high risk, publicly exposed, to me, that's a bit scary. I would be concerned. Now, some consumers don't necessarily have the ability to like strong arm their vendor into upgrading. They just may have to deal with it until they can replace the vendor. And sometimes that's cost prohibitive. But it is a bit scary to see that there's that much, that of the Java, most of it is in things that are much older versions. They're not running Java 21 or whatever. It's usually, it's mostly EOL. And even Java 8 is pretty much EOL unless you have agreements as well. So both 7 and 8 are effectively EOL unless you're paying Oracle.
As a saying, like, as a Go developer, like writing a lot of Go code here, I really like the fact that we can fingerprint exact version ranges of the Go crypto stack. It lets us know, like, okay, do we have an older instance? But effectively, the runZero fingerprinting can tell you which version ranges of Java, of course, but also which ranges of Go you have in place. And that's super helpful for determining whether your stack is out of date, specifically because the TLS stack in Go is tied to the runtime version. So if you have an older version of the Go runtime, it's going to have other vulnerabilities, not just TLS, but you can remotely fingerprint them through TLS, which is great.
Yep, it's another great proxy indicator.
Rob, do you want to weigh in here before we move on to the next segment?
I was just going to make a bad joke about proxies and SSL and proxy indicators, but I'll let it go.
Come on, really? All right. Okay, then, folks, we're going to move on to the last segment for this month's runZero Hour, which is post-quantum TLS. And I'm going to give Tom a break here because I want to make sure that everybody in the audience is sort of on the same page about quantum computing, because it's just like a buzzword that's thrown around a lot. So I'm going to do the very dangerous thing of trying to explain quantum computing or describe quantum computing in about 60 seconds before passing it back to Tom. So here goes. Don't judge me too much. All right, so the basic unit in classical computing is the bit, which can be a 1 or a 0, as we all know. And so in the space of n, right, thinking back to your math class, in the space of n, you can store or convey or compute just 2 raised to the power of n of information, right? And when you get down to the world of the super small, right, where quantum mechanics takes over, physical matter starts to show behaviors that are both like particles as well as waves. And when you take advantage of these quantum principles like superposition and quantum entanglements, you can go beyond just having 2 states. You can go beyond just having 1 or 0 within the same size of physical medium, for lack of a better description. So, of course, you need highly specialized hardware in order to take advantage of quantum mechanics. But if you have such a capability, you can perform certain types of calculations exponentially faster, right? Because it's not just 1 or 0, it's many states that you can just encapsulate in the same space. And one of those calculations that you can do exponentially faster is cryptography based on quantum computing or quantum algorithms. If you're interested, I'm going to put this in the chat in a little bit here. You could take a look at Shor's algorithm, right? It is an algorithm that is a quantum algorithm that is specifically designed to find prime factors from integers, which we all know is very important in PKI. So that's quantum computing. I do want to stress, though, that there's a whole field of how to use quantum computing in order to encrypt plain text payloads, but that is not what we're talking about here today, right? We're talking about post-TLS quantum, which is related, but not the encryption using quantum mechanics. So I'm going to pass it back to Tom here. What are we actually talking about with post-quantum TLS?
Huxley, real quick, do you want to hear my funny quantum computing story? It's not
Please
that
tell me.
funny. Okay, so
Oh, wait, no, come on.
there's a very so there's this guy, Scott Aronson, who writes a blog about mathematics, and he's got one of my favorite mathematical essays ever called Who Can Name the Bigger Number? And it's one of my if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's great. It's all about complexity theory. It's just wonderful. But anyway, so I would read his blog occasionally, and I noticed that his email address changed from whatever university he was teaching at before to utexas.edu here in Austin. And I was like, oh, well, I'm a welcoming person. I'm a good person. I want to make this gentleman feel welcome. He's probably new. He doesn't know anybody, whatever. And so I emailed him. I'm like, hey, I see you're in Austin now. Let me buy you lunch. Let me buy you coffee. And I assume that, he's just some random math blogger, right? I don't know anything about him really. And so he's like, yeah, sure, let's meet for lunch. And so I buy him lunch, we have coffee, and we chit chat and we talk. And then I come to find out he's the preeminent expert on quantum computing in the world. And he's just sitting with, my knowing nothing, anything, talking to him about, something at Astor's Ethiopian restaurant in downtown Austin. Very nice.
He agreed to have coffee with you?
Yes, I know. It was really quite fun. So super nice guy, super nice guy.
I like having drinks with you, but just a little surprised that.
Yes, yeah, I know. No, I had no idea how famous he was until I got home and was like, I should probably know more about this guy. And then I was like, oh crap, okay.
Okay, so Tom, you're gonna have to follow that and be just as interesting. Okay, so what is post-quantum TLS?
So, to expand on what Huxley was just talking about there, explaining like what quantum computers are and like sort of how they're a problem. By attacking this, the math that's underpinning the cryptography from a different perspective, like that actually has an analog in things that we've seen over the past 20 years. So, for example, whenever you wanted to crack passwords in the past, you can only do so at a certain speed because your CPU handled instructions at a certain rate. And so like if you wanted to break some passwords, you would try running plain text passwords through the algorithm, potentially with Assault on your CPU, and you might say get 1,000 attempts per second. And if you had a very long password, you weren't going to crack this password in a reasonable amount of time. Then comes the GPU crack. And so on GPUs, what you can do is you can load a whole bunch of these sets of data simultaneously and then execute them all in parallel at a scale that your CPU can't handle at all. And so instead of, say, getting 1,000 attempts per second, you're getting 100,000 attempts per second. And that just changes the feasibility of cracking passwords dramatically. And it has follow-on impacts. Well, if the hash becomes compromised, the risk profile has changed. It's more likely to be able to be attacked. And then you do different things. You require longer passwords. You implement different algorithms that are more resistant to this because they're slower to execute on both the CPU and the GPU. So like the ecosystem has to change to become more resilient to this new threat. And so that's a thing we went through. It had material impacts on our industry. It's used for a lot of other things like ML and stuff. But it's just a different capability came along in silicon that made us do things. Quantum cryptography, quantum computers will have a similar effect on TLS. It is, as Huxley said, it's very good at doing certain math that normal computers aren't. And that particular math, like our public key crypto, is based on factoring numbers. There are a couple other protocols, not protocols, but other sets of math that we base things like Diffie-Hellman on that also fall to these type of attacks, but they weren't anywhere close to feasible before, and now they may be in, say, the next 5 years, some near-term range, some meaningfully close range. So just because it can break crypto, like how does that matter? And the way that matters, in order to understand it, you kind of have to understand how we do TLS today. There's a couple different components. So in order to encrypt a conversation between people, you have to agree upon typically a cryptographic algorithm, like say AES or DES, and then the key. And that cryptographic algorithm is public. We want it to be attacked. We want it to be as visible as possible, to be audited. Everybody should have a copy of it. You don't rely on the secret of that. You rely on the secret of the key. And you determine attributes about the key based on your risk tolerance. Things like, how long do I need to protect this? Is it will it, can it be attacked? But you've got the secret key. And typically for things like AES, the cryptography is called symmetric. The key can be used to encrypt and decrypt. That's great. So that means you have a key, and I can say, for example, send a message to Rob, and anybody who just picks up that conversation in the middle, they see it on the wire, they're going to have a very difficult time cracking that. Well, the problem you have is key agreement or key sharing. How do I get that key to Rob? How do we exchange keys so that we know what it is so we can do this encryption? And there's a couple different mechanisms that are used today. One of those is using asymmetric encryption, which is basically, if you have a TLS certificate, it's one of the things it's used for is that. The certificate technically has a public part and a private part, and you share the public part with third parties. It's public. And then you keep the private part and you never let it be divulged. And there are things that you can do with those certificates because of how they're mathematically linked that, for example, if I have Rob's public key, I can use that to encrypt our AES secret, and then I can send that to Rob. And because of the mathematics that are involved, only Rob with the private key can decrypt that. So now I have a way for Rob and I to exchange the secret key that we can then use to encrypt AES with. And so you may be like, well, if you're already exchanging secrets, why don't you go with just RSA for the whole thing? And the reason for that is RSA is crazy slow compared to AES for having those conversations. So you want to take advantage of the speed and efficiency of AES, and then you just want to leverage the additional cryptographic properties of these private, public-private asymmetric keys just long enough to get the key across and then lean on AES. Diffie-Hellman, either finite field or elliptic curve crypto, kind of serves the same purpose where you do key agreement. You both share secrets in a way that a third party can't reconstruct even if they observe the traffic, but they both rely on things that that quantum computers are great at cracking.
So everything that you just mentioned is potentially attackable by these quantum algorithms.
Yep. Yeah. So, and those are foundational parts. They like how you get started having communications involve these technologies generally. And so, like, even though AES itself isn't one of those that quantum computers is really good at attacking, it impacts it. It cuts its effective key size by half, but it's still valid. So instead of using AES 128, use AES 256, and you're back at where you have the same relative strength. So we don't have to change that part of it, but the key exchange, the key agreement, the stuff of the certificates itself can be broken by quantum computers. And then things like identity, the way you verify that the server you're talking to is the server you want to be talking to, is we have this chain of trust where you have certificate issuers that issue certificates, that then issue certificates to that server or whatever. And the way that they prove that they're the person is they use that certificate that's only been issued to them, theoretically. And they sign a blob of data. And so if you have the public key, you can verify that they signed that. And by verifying that only they could sign this blob and that it's legitimately signed, you can say, okay, that's Rob's server. He signed it. And I know it's Rob because runZero said it's Rob. And then some other certificate authority said runZero is actually runZero. So you just walk the chain of trust and you go, okay, they signed it, it's legit. That signature is also attackable by quantum computing. And so like this whole set of basic upfront constructs is broken by quantum computing.
So how does post quantum make it immune to quantum computing?
So there's been a lot of work over probably a decade plus because they've known this problem's coming, of trying to find protocols that are resilient to the theoretical attacks from quantum computing. Because until you get a quantum computer of sufficient size, like you can theorize that it can do a thing. You can implement emulation and then extrapolate what its performance might be and all that. But it's just been a lot of people put in a ton of work, and crazy smart people, to try to find mechanisms, algorithms that we can use that are just as resilient or more resilient to attacks by quantum computers as RSA would have been to a classic computer. And you need that to be not just resilient to quantum computers, like you need to be resilient to all known forms of attack, classical and quantum. And so there's been competitions to try to find and produce this. And it works a lot like the competition that originally produced AES. In the back of the day, NIST is like, okay, here's the things we want to do. Here's our constraints and propose crypto systems. And then it'll be open to the public. And then anybody can go attack it to try to find the flaws. And then over time, we like whoever's left standing, we see who fits the best and we adopt it as a standard. That's AES was originally called Rindal, and it survived the abuse and it was adopted by NIST. And we use it everywhere now. Well, this is the same way. They have a competition. It's public. It's open. People propose things. Other people attack those. They try to find weaknesses. And then it's been mostly narrowed down to just a handful of either specific algorithms or families of algorithms that I'm not going to get into. Like, I'm not a crypto nerd. I'm more of a crypto fanboy. Like, I understand the general concepts about it, but some of the stuff is really deep. And the people who both create and attack these are astoundingly brilliant. But we have some front-running contenders that have been adopted in a draft, and I think here in the next couple of months, NIST is supposed to announce the formal winners of the protocols. And so we have a couple suites like for key exchange, they're going to be called Kyber, like in Kyber crystals from Star Wars, of a couple different strengths. These are, I think, lattice-based math. And then you've got signatures for the new signature algorithms. They're called dilithium 2.
Star Wars and Star Trek. Okay.
Yes. Like, let's just pull in the fans from each and then let them fight.
It was all fine until the shadows attacked.
So even though these are just competitions, we are seeing post-quantum TLS endpoints out in the wild, are we not? I mean, we've been able to identify them.
Yes. So it's been drafted, and then like there are a couple projects trying to implement these because they want to make sure they're workable. There are a lot of challenges along with this, and not just the math, but just operational challenges that go along with this. And so there are various folks who have been projects who have been implementing this so that we can start exercising this. And there, like an example of this today is you can turn on a flag in Chrome and go to certain websites, and it'll negotiate post-quantum cryptography. And basically the way it works is the client advertises both support for classic and post-quantum, and the server selects the ones it wants. So if the server only wants post-quantum, it selects the post-quantum. And so now you have post-quantum encrypted tunnel and you're good to go. But if one or the other doesn't support it, then they just fall back to using what's there. I mean, they fall back to using classical stuff. So it's a very resilient system for advertising support and opportunistically selecting the thing you need while still allowing folks running older versions of software and browsers to still communicate and check their mail, do whatever it is, so yes, you can do this in the wild, and we see this particularly for OpenSSH. There are implementations in our lab that are software that is in the wild that people are advertising and using post-quantum crypto today. It's there. You can do it without turning on anything specific.
Okay. It's pretty cool that we can do that now already, even though, it's not really a common thing in production. So I'll end with this one last question. Is this really important now? Because you hear about this whole harvest now, decrypt later type of initiative, which certain entity or entities might be doing. Basically, for those who don't know, they're basically just saving data, encrypted data from whatever networks they can listen on, and storing them so that they can decrypt at a later time once the compute power has caught up. Is that a real thing, you think, Tom, or is that just conspiracy theory? Like, should we worry about that type of stuff?
I would say I believe it to be a real thing. That certain adversaries are collecting that data. Maybe friendlies are collecting that data, storing it long term because they have an operational requirement to potentially be able to decrypt data later. And it doesn't have to be because they can attack it with post-quantum. It could be because they're able to compromise an endpoint, steal the private keys. And so if they're not using what's called forward secrecy or perfect forward secrecy that sort of mitigates this, you can potentially, with certain cyber suites, if you get to the keys today, you can go back in time and look and decrypt sessions from that were held a couple of years ago. There was a lot of work done by Google and a bunch of others to implement what's called perfect forward secrecy to address that, but it's still a risk, and it's still a practical risk that doesn't involve quantum computers ever manifesting at a scale. So yeah, I think it's something to be concerned. Obviously, people's risk profiles differ. If the only thing you need to protect is like your session keys for a short period of time for somebody authenticating and doing a thing, and if it becomes public knowledge a day later, it doesn't matter. Well, it's not that big a deal for you. If you're protecting nation state secrets, or if you're protecting financial transfers, if you're doing things in which you have an obligated affirmative action to protect this data for 5 years, then you have to project out into the future. What does my attack surface look like, and what are the attacker capabilities in 5 years? And if that includes quantum, then you kind of have to have an obligation to start exercising that as soon as reasonably possible. If you're a government, that they're actually, particularly U.S. government, that's actually more meaningful, because you have guidelines for deadlines for when you need to be able to understand your quantum footprint or capabilities, and you have other guidelines where, for example, the NSA has set a deadline of 2035 for adopting post-quantum only crypto across national security systems. Like, you can't support both; you have to be PQ only, and there are challenges with that. I mean, 2035 is a long time away, but like, for anybody who's maintained systems that has to do legacy compatibility, who have challenges with systems that are outside their control about software updates and hardware updates, regulatory, like medical systems where you can't really touch the system without getting recertified. There's all kinds of challenges that make 10-year timelines effectively, like, they feel like they're much shorter. There are also practical operational challenges that impact that as well. So, for example, whenever TLS 1.3 came out, one of the biggest challenges they had after they had a draft and they started implementing it was there are middle boxes, there are load balancers and other technologies between the endpoints that are messing with the TLS traffic. They may be terminating it, they may be decrypting it, they're doing various things to the traffic that are legit, they're there. A proxy in a business where the business is observing the TLS encrypted traffic, your client talks to the proxy talks to the endpoint. What they found was there are a lot of protocol stacks in them that implemented just enough TLS to get it working most of the time. And then anytime you sent certain, like if you sent a protocol version that identified as TLS3 and not 1.2, it just broke because they didn't account for it. They just assumed it was going to be one of these 4 values, and that's it. If you give it anything else, it drops the connection. That's not what the protocol spec says. That's not how they're supposed to do it, but it broke anyway. And so they actually had to delay releasing it because the things they were doing that were legitimate, that should have worked per spec, it should have been completely backwards compatible, got broken by middle boxes or by software on the endpoint. And so they just, it became an impediment to deployment. And you're going to see the same thing with PQ. You're going to find things that don't deal with having 2 implementations or two sets of certificates there. And there are things that are going to take time to shake out. And obviously vendors who don't upgrade their software that often. Like, you're still running OpenSSL 1.x, you're not getting PQ.
All right. And that is all that we have time for today. Thank you very much. I mean, there are 83 of you who stuck around with us past the hour. Thank you very much, all of you. Please join us for the next runZero hour in March. Look out for the invite over email or social media. Thank you very much, everybody.